Having imagined the West as a pristine land awaiting civilization, many Americans tried to mold the region to fit the image that they had of it. That meant ensuring that the Indian tribes would not remain obstacles to the spread of white society. The traditional policy of the federal government was to regard the tribes simultaneously as independent nations and to negotiate treaties which were ratified by the Senate. However, treaties or agreements with the tribes seldom survived the pressure of white settlers eager for access to Indian lands. Thus, the relations between the United States and the Native Americans was one of endless broken treaties. And by the 1850s, in the face of white demands for access to Indian land, the idea of establishing one great reservation on which many tribes could live was developed. It was called concentration, and each tribe was assigned to a defined reservation confirmed by separate treaties. The policy of concentration divided the tribes from one another, and it made them easier to control. It also allowed the government to force tribes into scattered locations and to take over the most desirable lands for white settlement. The plan, however, did not work very well, mostly because Indian tribes resisted the assignment to these reservations. In 1867, after a series of bloody conflicts between Indians and white settlers, Congress established something called the Indian Peace Commission. The Indian Peace Commission was made up of soldiers and civilians, and its job was to recommend a new policy of dealing with Native Americans in the West. The Commission recommended replacing concentration policy with a plan to move all the Plains Indians into two large reservations. One would be in Indian Territory, or modern-day Oklahoma, and the other would be in the Dakota Territory. Of course, this solution hardly worked any better than the previous ideas, and management of the reservations and Native American policy was entrusted to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was a branch of the Department of Interior. The Bureau of Indian Affairs were responsible for distributing the land to the tribes, for making payments, and supervising shipments of supplies. Its record, to say the least, was appalling, and many of the leadership positions were filled with incompetent and/or dishonest men. Worsening the fate of the tribes was the Anglo-American relentless slaughtering of the buffalo herds that supported the tribe's way of life, as we've already talked about. After the Civil War, the demand for buffalo hides became a national phenomenon. It became all the rage in the East to have a buffalo hide. So railroad companies also aided in this slaughtering of the buffalo when they hired riflemen such as William Buffalo Bill Cody to arrange these large shooting expeditions in order to kill large numbers of buffalo. It was an attempt by the railroads to thin out the herds because they were becoming an obstruction to the railroad traffic. So gangs of professional hunters began swarming over the plains to shoot these huge animals. The Army and the agents for the Bureau of Indian Affairs condoned and even encouraged the killing of the buffalo. For instance, General Philip Sheridan of Civil War fame declared, quote, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring about lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." So as a result, by the mid-1880s, only a few hundred of the estimated 13 million buffalo in the 1850s still existed. Destroying the buffalo herds also destroyed the Indian source of food and supplies. It contributed to a climate in which Indian warriors also felt the need to fight to preserve their way of life. And so this is when you'll see a lot of Indian wars erupt. And there was almost constant fighting between whites and Indians from the 1850s up until the 1880s, as many Native American tribes struggled against the growing threat to their civilization. Indian warriors began attacking wagon trains, stagecoaches, and isolated ranches. And as the U.S. Army became more deeply involved in the fighting, the tribes began to focus most of their attacks on white soldiers. In 1862, the starving Dakota Sioux went on the attack under Chief Little Crow. Before U.S. troops could subdue the uprising Sioux, they killed more than 700 white settlers in Minnesota. And at the same time, fighting flared up in eastern Colorado, where the Arapaho and Cheyenne were coming into conflict with white miners in the region. Bands of Indians attacked stagecoach lines and settlements to regain lost territory. In response, whites called up the militia. The governor of Colorado urged friendly Indians to congregate at the army post for protection. And so some Arapaho and Cheyenne groups under the leadership of Chief Black Kettle responded to this invitation from the governor, and they camped near Fort Lyon on Sand Creek. In November 1864 at Sand Creek, Colonel John Shivington and his local Colorado militia savagely killed 270 Cheyenne, primarily old men, women, and children. Black Kettle himself escaped the Sand Creek massacre, but was eventually killed by some of George Custer's men a few years later. Gold fever further fueled conflict between Indians and white settlers on the northern plains. The U.S. government in 1868 negotiated what was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Cheyenne and the Sioux, which guaranteed Indians control of their sacred land in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. Yet the discovery of gold in the Black Hills led the federal government to break its promise and that they were going to preserve this land for the Indians. Miners and the Northern Pacific Railroad workers began to invade the region. The Sioux rebelled in 1875, and they left the reservation. Under the leadership of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, the Sioux tribes mounted a resistance and won a crushing victory against Lieutenant Colonel George Custer in 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn. The tribal warriors had surprised Custer and his 264 members of his regiment. They surrounded them and they killed every man. The chiefs had gathered as many as 2,500 warriors, and this was one of the largest Indian armies ever assembled at one time. But the Indians did not have the political organization, nor did they have the supplies to keep all these troops united. And so their leaders, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, were eventually forced back to the reservations. Later, incidentally, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were both killed by reservation police. Facing the extinction of their traditional ways of life, different groups of Indians responded in different ways in the waning decades of the 19th century. And probably one of the most dramatic episodes in Native American history occurred in Idaho in 1877. The Nez Perce, under the leadership of Chief Joseph, were a small and relatively peaceful tribe. And under pressure from white settlers, the government had forced them onto a reservation. They instead attempted to flee to Canada to escape confinement on this reservation. After covering 1,000 miles in about 75 days, they were caught just short of the Canadian border. Chief Joseph was weary and he was discouraged, and he told the American general, quote, "I'm tired, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." The last Indians to maintain organized resistance against the whites were the Chiricahua Apaches, who fought intermittently from the 1860s to the late 1880s. The Apache tribes resorted to armed resistance and perfected a hit-and-run guerrilla warfare that terrorized white settlers and U.S. soldiers in the 1870s and 1880s. In the 1880s, their leader Geronimo repeatedly led the Apache warrior raiding parties off the reservation, but even the Apaches were eventually forced to surrender. The government arrested nearly 500 Apaches, though fewer than 36 had ever been hostile, and they sent them as prisoners to Florida, where more than a quarter of them died. In 1892, the Apaches were moved to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and then later to New Mexico. Another tragic encounter that occurred in 1890 was a result of a religious revival among the Sioux. Many tribes had turned to a visionary religion called the ghost dance as a means of preserving their native culture. Inspired by a prophet named Wovoka, the ghost dance promised a day when the land and the water would swallow up all of white civilization. All implements of white civilization would be buried, and all Indians would be united, and they would reclaim the earth. The government became alarmed at the possibility of renewed Indian uprising as a result of the ghost dance, so it began to arrest ghost dancers. The 7th Cavalry was dispatched to South Dakota to apprehend some of the Sioux ghost dancers who were believed to be armed for revolt. The cavalry caught up with the Sioux at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. And during the encounter, the troops opened fire and 200 men, women, and children were killed. Sitting Bull had joined the ghost dancers, and he was shot and killed later on by Indian agents as they tried to arrest him at his cabin on the Standing Rock Reservation. Although the massacre at Wounded Knee did not end the story of Native Americans, it did bring an end to a way of life. Now, even before the ghost dance and the Wounded Knee tragedy, the federal government had moved to forever destroy the tribal structure. The practice of relocating the Indians onto reservations lost momentum by the 1880s in favor of a new policy designed to encourage assimilation through farming and the ownership of private property. Eastern advocates of Indian rights began to voice their disgust with government policies. A woman by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson published a book in 1881 called A Century of Dishonor, and she documented all the dealings with the U.S. government with the Indians, the shameful practices that had been taking place. And Jackson's book will arouse public indignation, and people will begin calling for new legislation. Supporters of the new policies believed they were acting for the good of the Indians, whom they considered to be a vanishing race. Partly in response to critics of the reservation policy, Congress ended up passing what was known as the Dawes Act in 1887, which provided for the gradual elimination of tribal land ownership. It permitted the president to divide the land of any tribe and grant 160 acres to each head of the family. Now, this was a move to try to Americanize Indians by dealing with them as individuals rather than tribes. The government, under the Dawes Act, would hold the land in trust for 25 years, after which the owner would win full title. Indian rights groups viewed the Dawes Act as a positive initiative, but the act essentially stripped the Indians of their culture, and it reduced their land from 138 million acres to just 48 million. So while the image of the mythic West has often obscured the more ruthless features of Western expansion, by the turn of the century, the thriving farms, ranches, mines, and cities would help to transform the United States into a thriving nation.